Good evening, everyone. For those
Here we
of you that are ready to start, yeah. Good evening, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Gary Mond. I'm chairman of the National Jewish Assembly, and we're the organisation that's putting on this event tonight about Israel and international law. We have three speakers: Col Richard Kemp, Professor Avi Bell, and Natasha Hausdorff. I just wanted to, before I introduce Colonel Kemp, I just want to remind you, if those of you don't know, that if you like tonight's event and you want to come to many more National Jewish Assembly events, please go to our website, which is www.nja.org.uk. So thank you all very much indeed for joining us. It now gives me great pleasure to introduce Colonel Richard Kemp. Richard Kemp spent most of his life fighting terrorism and insurgency. He's commanded British troops on the front line of some of the world's toughest hotspots, including Afghanistan, Iraq, the Balkans, and Northern Ireland. He served in active duty from 1977 to 2006, during which time he held the position of an infantry battalion commanding officer. His tenure included leading Operation Fingal in Afghanistan from July 2003 to November 2003. He has untold amounts of experience, and he's one of Israel's most cogent and effective spokesperson. Whenever things heat up and terrorists such as Hamas pop their heads up and to stir up trouble, Richard is there to comment and to advise what is going on. He wants to look people in the eye, speak to them, describe to the world what exactly is transpiring, while global news editions are building their own narratives. It gives me great pleasure to invite Colonel Richard Kemp, CBE, to speak to us now. Richard.
Thank you very much indeed, and it's a pleasure to be with you. I'm speaking to you tonight from Israel. I've been here since last Monday, and in that time, I'll just tell you briefly what I've been up to. I've visited IDF troops on the Gaza border on several days. I've visited IDF troops on the Lebanon border, and I've spoken to commanders there, and I've seen how their preparations have been going, both for defending Israel against Lebanese Hezbollah in the north and attacking Hamas in the south. I've also visited Sderot and Kfar Aza, two of the places that were devastated by Hamas the weekend before last, and I've seen with my own eyes the atrocities that have been committed, or the remnants of the atrocities that have been committed in those two places. They're both pretty much now ghost towns. Pretty much only the IDF presence in Kfar Aza, and some civilians remaining in Sderot. But it showed me, all of that showed me, on top of what I've seen in media footage, the reason why Israel has to go in hard into Gaza. But before I talk briefly about that and my understanding of the legal aspects of it, I just want to share with you that my view is that this whole war is down to Iran. Hamas and Hezbollah, Hamas and Islamic Jihad in Gaza are funded, trained, equipped, armed, and directed by Iran. Hezbollah in Lebanon, the same. The proxies that exist of Iran in Syria, who have been pushed closer to the border with a potential view of attacking Israel from there, also under Iran's hand. So this is a war between Iran and Israel using these proxies. And Israel has no choice but to deal with them. Israel's certainly going to deal with Hamas in Gaza, and Israel may well have to deal decisively with Hezbollah in Lebanon. We've seen, all of us have seen, the predictable lies, distortion, propaganda against Israel churned out in the media, in so much of the British media and other world media, some politicians, universities. We've seen all of this happening, even in the knowledge of what occurred 2 weekends ago around the Gaza border area. So if these people still cannot bring themselves to back Israel's need to protect its own civilian population, then I don't know what will. But it is bad, and it's going to get worse. We don't know what Israel will be doing. We expect them to go in on the ground in Gaza soon, and it's going to be a very tough fight. some of the distortions that we've seen as a result of Israel's air campaign so far are unspeakable. And the one that comes to mind, I think, among most people now is the incident that occurred not against a hospital in southern Gaza, but in the car park of that hospital, when the BBC and other commentators immediately jumped to the conclusion this is Israel and it's a war crime, before it came to light, before any facts came to light, and the reality that this was not Israel, this was Islamic Jihad, a terrorist group in Gaza. Israel would never deliberately attack a hospital, with the exception of a case when perhaps the hospital had been largely evacuated and was being used as a military location. And a hospital, a school, a mosque, all of these places are used by Hamas, by Islamic Jihad, as military locations from which to fight, command, and act and take action against Israel. And when that happens, when that occurs, as with civilian apartment blocks or any other areas where civilians are, to attack them, to attack those places, is not a war crime, despite what everybody in the media or so many people in the media will tell you. And Israel has to do a number of things. And I'm conscious of the fact that I'm being listened to now by two preeminent lawyers, Avi and Natasha. And so if I say anything that is legally incorrect, I'm not a lawyer, I'm a practitioner of military law on the battlefield. If I say anything that's not 100% right, I'm sure when they speak, they will correct me, and I hope so. But providing Israel distinguishes between civilian and military targets when it's attacking a military target where civilians are, providing Israel, if it's possible, warns the civilians to get out, and if Israel uses force that is proportionate to the military advantage of carrying out that attack, then doing so is not a war crime. And proportionality is very often misunderstood. It doesn't mean you've got to have the same number of deaths on both sides. What it means is that the amount of force used must be proportionate to what you hope to gain from it militarily. And that can include, for example, I'll give you a couple of brief examples. If you want to hit a Hamas rocket launch site and there are civilians there, then you make a calculation. The military commander makes a calculation. Is it necessary and is it proportionate to attack that rocket launch site? It is necessary because Israeli civilians, Israeli soldiers could die as a result of the rocket being launched. If there are 100 civilians there, attacking that rocket site does not make it disproportionate. If there are 10 there, it doesn't. If there are 1,000 there, it doesn't make it disproportionate. If some are going to get killed, but you're going to save the lives of your own civilian population or your soldiers, then you can, providing you judge that it's the right thing to do, you can carry out that attack. If, on the other hand, let's say there's a ration truck with food or water that Hamas might use, and there are lots of civilians around there, you might judge that is not
these away.
Someone's speaking, sorry.
Oh, could everyone be put on mute? Thanks.
I've muted them.
Good, thanks. Carry on.
All right. So I might say, well, Hamas will sustain themselves with food and water, etc. But is that really a major problem for me? And I might say, no, it isn't a major problem for me, so I won't carry out that attack. I might consider it to be disproportionate if civilians are going to die. That's just two examples. I've faced this sort of situation myself many times in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Northern Ireland, exactly that problem. And it's the commander on the ground that has to make the calculation. And he's given rules of engagement to guide him. They're not lawyers. There's not a lawyer sitting on his shoulder. They've got to make that decision on their own. So that's one thing I think was worth emphasizing in this. And another area I wanted to speak about briefly, and Avi and Natasha might want to enlarge on this, is the controversy that's been going on about the siege that Israel claimed to have been mounting on Gaza, and also the instructions for civilians to move. First of all, the siege. To deprive your enemy of food, water, electricity, and other resources that it can use to fight against you is something that is entirely proper, legal, and reasonable. and necessary in many cases. It's been used throughout the history of warfare, including more recently, for example, by the Ukrainians fighting the Russians. So contrary to what people say, and people who should know better, like the United Nations Deputy Commissioner for something or other and the EU, besieging Gaza is not illegal per se. I think the requirements of the military commander that decides to impose a siege is that he should do everything he can to minimize the impact on the civilian population. But his operations must be effective. And in a war, we're not talking, this is not kind of a police situation, it's a war where soldiers can and should kill the enemy. And that includes by depriving them of the necessary means of existing and fighting. And he has to, when deciding how tightly to impose that stranglehold, he has to decide how much an effect it can have on the civilian population. It has to take that into account. I believe from everything I know, from what I've seen of this operation that's going on now, Israel is not intending or expecting to starve any civilians to death or deprive them of water that they need to survive. And the second thing that I would say on the thing I say about moving people south, again, we've had UN commissioners and senior UN people, Red Cross even, saying that telling people to go south is a war crime. It isn't. It's not. It's the opposite of war crime. It's actually a legal requirement on the IDF. They haven't instructed people to go south. What they've done is they've warned people that there's going to be intensive attacks in the north, and the safest place to be is in the south, which is perfectly legal and is a requirement under international law. So Israel's justified in doing that. Hamas, on the other hand, are not justified in what they've done, which is to tell people to stay put in Gaza City. That is a war crime. Hamas actually do have a responsibility to move their civilian population away from the great areas of greatest danger. I'm just going to conclude because I know I've been banging on too long. I apologize. But one thing I should say is that we none of us should forget that Hamas, the objective of Hamas, is for the IDF to kill their civilians. They want the IDF to kill their civilians. They're the only army that I know of in the history of the world, if you could call them an army, that has deliberately provoked and planned their operations in such a way that Israel will kill some of their civilians. They want it. Why do they want it? They want it because that's a weapon against Israel. It's a way of delegitimizing Israel, of vilifying Israel, and of isolating Israel. And that weapon has worked very effectively right up until now. I've been to many a debate at the UN Human Rights Council, which has condemned Israel for acts that are necessary to defend Israel. And each time they condemn Israel, because innocent civilians have died, unfortunately, despite Israel's best efforts, that provokes Hamas to do it again and again and again. And in this situation, the more pressure that is brought on Israel to desist in its military operations, the more likely there is going to be blood shed in the future. Final thing, people often forget this, but a military commander has to bear really three main things in mind. The first one is to destroy the enemy. That's his primary objective. The second one is to prevent the death of innocent civilians, if it can be done. And the third one, which is the one that everyone forgets, is that he has to try and minimize the death of his own soldiers. A soldier's life is no less important than the life of a civilian. And not only that, but for a commander, he has to keep the maximum possible number of soldiers alive so he can be most effective on his primary mission of attacking. Thank you very much.
Richard, thank you so much for that very, very impressive contribution to the situation. It's fascinating to hear what you have to say. It's also very, very educational. In a moment, I'm going to introduce Professor Avi Bell. Before I do, though, I just want to tell everyone that you will have the opportunity to ask questions, and lots of them, but you must do so in the chat. So if you've got questions, please put them in the chat, and later on in the evening, I will read your questions out and we'll get answers to them. So our next speaker tonight is Professor Avi Bell. Professor Bell is a member of the Faculty of Law at Bar-Ilan University and the University of San Diego School of Law, and he serves as a senior fellow at the Kohelet Policy Forum. His fields of academic research have included property, intellectual property, law, international law, land use law, the laws of war, and the Arab-Israeli conflict. Professor Bell is considered one of the leading researchers in Israel in the field of economic analysis of law, and he's also a member of the Israeli Law and Economics Association, as well as the American Law and Economics Association. Professor Bell was director of the Global Law Forum at the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs between 2008 and 2009. Avi, over to you.
Thank you very much. Richard did such a wonderful job that I feel like I have to dance between the raindrops here to find things that won't be repetitive, but I'll do my very best. So let's understand something about, well, two things about the laws of war. So first of all, the laws of war are a very funny field because they're based on moral theory. They're actually based on primarily on the work of a Christian theologian, Thomas Aquinas, and it's based explicitly on his moral theological philosophy, in particular a doctrine called double effects. But it has a very, very funny and macabre angle to it. Laws of war are the laws of dealing death and destruction, right? The laws of war tell us how much death you can deal and how much destruction you can deal, when it's permissible and when it's not permissible. And that has to be borne in the background. War is not illegal. It's lawful in this world to use military force to achieve certain kinds of aims, primarily self-defense, to defend the country against external enemies, to defend the citizenry against terrorist organizations. And that defense involves the use of military force that kills people and that destroys things. And it does so lawfully. Okay? Now, that's one thing to bear in mind about the laws of war. The other thing to bear in mind is that the laws of war are very, very important to both sides in this conflict, but in very, very different ways. And the laws of war are important to Israel. They're built in to the operations of the Israel Defense Forces. Israel takes great care to operate according to the rules of war, the laws of war. It explicitly follows, in some cases copies wholesale, both procedures and rules from other NATO armies. Israeli military planners, Israeli military lawyers are in touch with planners and lawyers from other NATO forces. And that's the way things are set up. Now, as Richard said, there's two basic rules that are most important in the conduct of operations. There's a third one that runs alongside. And I'm actually going to mention that third one first because Richard discussed the first two at great length. But there's a concept called necessity, military necessity. And the basic idea is that all military operations, anything that's done in the military context, in the martial war context, has to serve a military necessity. But military necessity doesn't mean that it absolutely has to be done. Military necessity means all those things that help you defeat and destroy the enemy. Right? And so it may be that there are 5 different ways to achieve an object. All of them serve the purpose of military necessity. Right? Now, that has to be borne in mind when then gets to the major 2 rules. The major 2 rules, as Richard said, are distinction and proportionality. You must aim your attacks only at legitimate targets. Legitimate targets are persons who are either combatants or participating in the hostility, even though they're not combatants. There are unfortunately a lot of them on the Palestinian side in this conflict, which makes it difficult to figure out who's who. And you can aim your fire legitimately at objects that assist the enemy in their military efforts. So it's commonly, you describe them as military targets, but that's a misnomer. The targets do not have to be military. They simply have to be of assistance to the other side in their military efforts. So, for example, if a broadcast station, an ordinarily civilian broadcast station or a power station, are used by the enemy to advance their military efforts. Right? You have a power station that powers the electricity in the underground tunnels that Hamas uses, and obviously they need a lot of electricity. They can't see, they can't breathe down there without a steady source of electricity. That makes that power station a legitimate target. Notwithstanding the fact that it also has civilian uses. The same thing for broadcast facilities, and the same thing even in some cases when you're talking about medical clinics or hospitals. So, for example, Shifa Hospital in Gaza City is well known as the communications headquarters of Hamas during wartime. It's so well known that all the foreign media know that if you want to get an interview with Hamas leadership, you have it in the parking lot or in the entrance of Shifa Hospital, and the Hamas terrorists will come out and meet the journalists and then go back into the basement of Shifa. You'll see all kinds of terrorists wandering through the hallways, and of course there are munitions there. There's good video from the past of rockets, missiles being launched from the parking lot of Shifa Hospital. Now, the rule of proportionality says that when you're attacking a legitimate target, it is okay, it's permissible, even expected that there will be collateral damage to civilians, to protected items, to churches, to mosques, to hospitals that are not being used for military purposes. And that collateral damage is acceptable as long as it is not clearly excessive in relation to the military necessity. And the military necessity, again, is everything that helps you destroy the enemy. And here I just want to reiterate one point that Richard said. Force protection is legitimate. Right? So if you look, for example, at there's a report of the prosecutor of the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia regarding the bombing campaign of NATO forces. There were a number of organizations that lodged complaints that NATO pilots were instructed to fly high so they couldn't be reached by anti-aircraft. And the result was that there was they had lower ability to engage in fine distinctions and targeting, meaning that there was a greater likelihood of errors that killed innocent civilians while targeting proper targets. And the prosecutor said that there is no grounds for prosecuting, and there's no grounds for prosecuting even though it was certain that some civilians would die as a result of the pilots flying higher than the range of the anti-aircraft. Protecting the pilots from enemy fire is a perfectly legitimate military necessity, right? That is something that commanders may take into account, and as Richard said, should take into account. Right? It's vital to be able to protect your forces. Now, so you have Israel conducting a campaign according to the rules of war. It's not perfectly easy to do this. This does require some thought and some review as you go along. But I can tell you that Israel conducting according to the rules of war will lead to an enormous amount of civilian casualties for the very simple reason that the military necessity is high, and Hamas is deliberately embedded within the civilian population. And that means that if you go to the urban areas, you go to Gaza City, there are thousands and thousands and thousands of legitimate targets that are in mosques, that are in hospitals, that are in clinics, that are in schools, that are in residential buildings, that are in journalist headquarters, that are strewn around everywhere. And the amount of collateral damage is going to be enormous. And this is why the very best way to reduce the collateral damage is doing what Israel is doing, which is warning civilians, please leave. Don't let yourselves be human shields for Hamas. Now, I said it's important for both sides, and I know I've run on a bit, but I'm going to just say very briefly why laws of war are important for the other side, for Hamas. And it's not because Hamas has any interest in obeying these rules. In fact, Hamas systematically violates just about every major rule of the laws of war, plus other rules of human rights, the Genocide Convention, treaties against terrorism. Hamas violates them all. If you look at just what they did in the atrocities of October 7th, not only did they kill non-combatants systematically, intentionally, they engaged in brutalities that are war crimes, rape, mutilation, torture, violence aimed at babies, at infants, and some of the imagery is just horrible. There's read the summaries of the autopsies, and you'll discover these descriptions of bodies that were fused together by fire. Hamas terrorists killed and then torched everything, or in some cases killed by torching the people and burning them alive. But you have bodies fused together of mother and child that were burned to death together, and it's horrifying. Now, in addition to doing all of that, Hamas engages in other war crimes. It uses human shields. It does so deliberately. It takes hostages, and it threatens the hostages, and it mutilates the hostages, and it abuses the hostages. All these are war crimes. Now, it's also important that Hamas is a terrorist organization, and this is not a matter of politics. This is a matter of law. It's a terrorist organization, as the term is used in the International Convention for the Suppression of the Financing of Terrorism, and the International Convention for the Suppression of Terrorist Bombings, and the international conventions against hostage taking, and various Security Council resolutions. There's no doubt it's a terrorist organization, and there are rules that attach to that. So, for example, states are forbidden to provide even passive, indirect support to a terrorist organization. Hamas is also explicitly a genocidal organization. It has the aim of killing the Jewish people as a whole or in part, as required by the Genocide Convention for there to be crimes of genocide, and it has killed people in service of that aim. Those are acts of genocide, which means that every state in the world, it's not just Israel's responsibility to destroy Hamas. Every state in the world has a duty, a legal duty, to prevent Hamas carrying out further crimes and to punish it for the crimes that it's already committed. So all the people who are sitting in the cheap seats telling Israel what it's permitted to do are violating their own duties. It's their duty under law to prevent and to punish. Now, this brings me to the last question. Then why are the laws of war important to Hamas if it systematically violates them? The answer is that one of the central pieces of Hamas's propaganda efforts, of its war efforts, is to create a narrative in which it twists the laws of war and it twists the facts in order to try to create international pressure on Israel to stop operations. That is, the Hamas modus operandi is to carry out atrocities and then carry out war crimes such as human shielding to try to create a situation in which Israel is attacked by the civilized nations of the world who should know better and told to stop fighting, so that Hamas lives to fight another day, to kill more Jews, to commit genocide again, to ransom off its hostages and seize more hostages, to do all the other horrible things Hamas does. And so when people in the BBC, for example, echoes Hamas propaganda, it's executing a part of Hamas, the terrorist organization, the genocidal organization's war strategy. Their war strategy involves twisting the facts, distorting the law, and creating these narratives of imaginary crimes of Israel while covering up, or barely even covering up, their own. Gary, you're muted.
Sorry about that. Thank you so much indeed, Avi, for that fascinating coverage. And it's now my great pleasure to introduce our third speaker, Natasha Hausdorff. Natasha is a barrister in London and a director of UK Lawyers for Israel. She holds law degrees from Oxford and Tel Aviv universities and was a fellow in the National Security Law Programme at Columbia Law School. Natasha previously worked for Skadden Arps in London and Brussels, and clerked for the President of the Israel Supreme Court, Chief Justice Miriam Naor, in Jerusalem. Natasha speaks very frequently on international law, foreign affairs, and national security policy. Natasha, over to you.
Gary, thank you so much. It's a real privilege to be here and joining Richard and Avi, especially at a time like this. And I echo absolutely everything that they have both said about international humanitarian law, the laws of armed conflict, and Israeli military practices. I think it's extremely important in the context we're witnessing now, where misrepresentations of the laws of war are utterly unprecedented, that we have a conversation like this. I read yesterday some remarks by John Kirby, a retired United States Navy Rear Admiral, who had purportedly said that the proper number of civilian casualties in a conflict like this is 0. Now, I just want to pick up on that ludicrous and deeply irresponsible statement, which I appreciate will now be perfectly plain in the context of the explanations we've already had from Richard and Avi. But I want to provide some practical context from the Jerusalem Post as to the American track record vis-a-vis Israel's. According to data from the United Nations, the global civilian to combatant ratio, so this is conflicts around the world, as an average, it's 9-1, meaning that on average, a disturbing 9 civilian casualties for every combatant are generated across armed conflicts. And according to data from the United States, the National Institute of Health there, the ratio produced by the United States in the 2003 Iraq War was 3-1. And in Afghanistan, various sources put the numbers at anywhere from 3-1 to 5-1. Now, the last Israeli operation, which was Operation Shield and Arrow, it was in Jenin, and I appreciate it's a very different context, but it's still pertinent. Israel achieved a ratio of 0.6-1 in that operation against terror. So more terrorists than civilians killed. That is a significantly lower ratio of civilian casualties compared to certainly any other conflict in the world that I have looked at. So I simply cannot explain how a military man like John Kirby would come out with a statement like that. But that is the environment in which Israel is currently operating. And it means that it's so much more important to have a proper informed discussion of international law and specifically the laws of war. And it strikes me that certainly comments like that feed into the media narrative that we have been witnessing, the utter misrepresentation of international law and this demand, which John Kirby has echoed, that Israel achieve 0 civilian casualties, quite apart from the fact that it is having been forced to conduct this operation in a densely populated civilian environment, not the most densely populated place on earth by a long shot, despite that phrase suddenly gaining currency, but still a densely populated environment where Hamas, as has been described, are using civilians as human shields. And I can certainly advocate for a proper analysis of previous Israeli military operations. The high-level military group in which Richard was a significant part has provided superb analysis from leading military generals, colonels, senior officers around the world who come to this with real life experience. One aspect that we've touched on briefly, but perhaps deserves a little bit more attention is that of siege. Because, of course, Richard explained that it is entirely lawful and entirely legitimate to subject the enemy to a siege, and it's an entirely appropriate method of conducting warfare. But I think what we've been seeing increasingly in the media is this suggestion, coupled as it often is with this absurd notion of collective punishment, that Israel is subjecting all of Gaza and all of the civilians there to a siege. Now, the first element that analysis, if we can call it that, fails to acknowledge, of course, is Egypt's control over the Rafah crossing and international calls, which I hope and trust will increase for that crossing to be used to facilitate the exit of civilians, properly screened, to ensure that hostages aren't smuggled out or even terrorists seeking to leave Gaza, but so that civilians are able to access humanitarian aid in the Sinai across the crossing in Rafah, the other side of the Rafah, of the border with Egypt, in the Egyptian Rafah, which exists there. And that is something that, bizarrely, we've seen very little call for when one considers how relatively easy that would be, practically speaking, for Egypt to facilitate. But Israel, it's important to stress when one looks at the humanitarian aspect of this, certainly it's not required to assist Hamas's war effort as it continues its onslaught. And while we have been on this webinar, I have seen that rockets have continued to fall and there have been sirens over central Israel. But it's also important to put into context that electricity, for instance, is a vital ingredient of Hamas's terror infrastructure, and that electricity is required to fire these missiles onto Israeli civilians. And clearly, we have seen repeatedly evidence that that Hamas prioritizes its terror infrastructure over the needs of Gazans. But it's important to stress that there is no international law obligation to even facilitate humanitarian aid in a situation where it is expected that that aid will be diverted to the enemy. And of course, in the context in which Hamas controls the entirety of Gaza, the passage, even of food and medicine, if facilitated from third parties, is undoubtedly going to land in the hands of Hamas. They are the ones with the guns, and they rule through brutal force in Gaza. And so the prospect of that actually getting through to civilians is potentially extremely slim. That's why that suggestion of Gaza and the other side of Rafah is such an important one. And of course, in terms of the Geneva and Hague regulations, sieges against Hamas specifically, when they are not aimed at starving civilian population, are lawful. And the IDF has been repeatedly clear about its objectives here: defeating Hamas, establishing a new reality in Gaza where Israel doesn't face a genocidal terror organization which has the capability, as well as the will, of course, to attack Israel, and rescuing the hostages. I thought I would just touch on a couple of, and I'll keep the rest of my remarks really short, a couple of aspects of the international community's obligations here. Avi has already mentioned the obligation to combat genocide, to effectively prevent and punish under the Genocide Convention. That was the first international treaty that criminalized genocide, and it obligates state parties to the convention to pursue its enforcement, the enforcement of that prohibition. And that is applicable to every state. Likewise, Avi mentioned the requirement or the prohibition on the indirect or direct funding of terror organizations. Another important international legal instrument that I know he's spoken about in previous days is Security Council Resolution 1373. That was adopted just after the September 11th attacks under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter. That is the only mechanism under which a body of the United Nations can actually create binding international law, and that mandates that states shall prevent and suppress the financing of terrorist acts and criminalize the willful provision or collection by any means, directly or indirectly, of funds by their nationals or in their territories with the intention that the funds should be used, or in the knowledge that they are to be used, in order to carry out terrorist acts. And that's an extremely important factor, law, to bear in mind when we consider the causes of what we have witnessed, of 3,000 terrorists infiltrating into Israel and committing these unspeakable atrocities. And on this point, I stress that it is not just Hamas that has conducted itself in this fashion. But those terrorists that infiltrated across the border on the 7th of October included PFLP members, divisions of the PLO, Fatah, and of course Palestinian Islamic Jihad. And I just issue a word of caution, because noting Israel's aim, which was essentially to destroy Hamas, if it succeeds and we are faced with a world after Hamas, the major concern of ending up going back to square one and these other organizations being able to continue their genocidal terrorist agenda against Israel with impunity is something that we must be on our guard against, especially in light of the international legal obligation to combat genocide, to punish it, and to ensure that terror financing is not able to take place. Coupled with that, rather than complying with its international legal obligations, what we have seen is incredible pressure on Israel for security concessions, which seem in very many respects to have led to the massacre that we saw and the situation that Israel now finds itself in. There were over 400,000 entries into Gaza in the course of this year between January and August on work permits. And that enabled the attackers to plan and coordinate their attacks so that they spread out across the border. They knew exactly the communities that they were going to infiltrate. They knew household by household how many people, how many children, and the instructions that they were discovered with once these Israeli forces were able to combat this onslaught included detailed instructions of what different terrorist groups ought to do to different families. And that is as a result of the pressure on Israel for cooperation and for further security concessions. In terms of the other aspects of the contribution to this that we have seen, there's been a great deal of discussion about the funding from Qatar being reduced, about the international discussion as to who would succeed Mahmoud Abbas, who does not appear to have very long left. The macro level power struggle between Hamas and other terrorist groups as a result of that succession issue, and the micro power struggle between particular actors, including Yahya Sinwar and Salah Aruri. All of that has undoubtedly contributed to the 2-year planning of this attack. And of course, we've heard a great deal about the expansion of the Abraham Accords, and Richard's references to Iranian involvement here cannot be overlooked, given its desire to prevent Saudi normalization with Israel. The last factor I just want to highlight in terms of the international community's contribution is critical to understanding, I think, what it is that Israel is facing, not just with Hamas, but the other terrorist organizations. And that is as a result of 30 years of brainwashing. How is it that people, human beings, could have conducted themselves in that fashion and committed such unspeakable atrocities? Well, Maurice Hirsch of the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs has provided statistical analysis to the effect that 3 out of 4 of the terrorists who committed that butcher and burning and rape grew up in and were educated in the UNRWA school system, which teaches the curriculum of the PA. None of this has been hidden. These textbooks and course materials that exalt martyrdom and call on everyone to slaughter as many Jews as possible, that has been the subject of repeated reports by Palestinian Media Watch, by Impact SE, campaigns by NGO Monitor to address international funding of incitement and incentives for terror. And I include in that also the PA Pay for Slay program, which has, importantly, paid the salaries of the Hamas terrorists released in the Gilad Shalit deal in 2011, while they were planning this attack over the last 2 years on a monthly basis. That's perhaps what I will leave you on, and I'm looking forward to your questions and further discussion about the international legal responsibilities, not just of Israel, but of the states that now seem to be piling in to pressure it in order to curtail its entirely lawful, entirely legitimate activity in acting in self-defense against these genocidal terrorists.
Thank you, Natasha. We're going to carry on with questions till about 10 to 8. So we've got 35 minutes. I've received quite a number privately, something like 10 or 11 questions already, but I will give priority to anybody who puts their questions in the chat, which is you were asked at the beginning. So the first question I have is this. We're seeing a creeping change in support for Israel, most notably in the media, as the IDF's Operation Iron Sword continues. Media outlets are murmuring accusations of war crimes and vengeance by Israel and breaches of international law in Gaza. Do you think countries so far supportive of Israel will relinquish their support? I'm going to ask Natasha first.
So I have seen extremely worrying reports recently that go to the content of Biden's, and Antony Blinken before him, their discussions with Israel and the pressure that they have been exerting, that I just essentially finished my remarks on, to curtail Israeli ability to conduct itself appropriately and according to the laws of armed conflict in this matter. And with respect to the provision of humanitarian aid, there seems to be a strong indication that the commitment that was just announced of $100 million US dollars to be provided to the Palestinians. And I draw upon my earlier remarks for that, because that is inevitably going to be funding and supporting, I should say, Hamas, because of their infiltration of humanitarian organizations in Gaza and because of their complete control. That has been required and made conditional upon Israel being provided with the armaments that it needs, that it requires to conduct its operation against Hamas terrorists, especially deep in the bunkers and the metro that they have built in Gaza. And on that basis, the switch of international opinion and international pressure, I think, has already very much taken place. It seems in many respects now also to be led by the United States. And that is of extreme concern. It is an absolute abrogation of responsibility in light of the causes that I outlined. It is often shameful and extremely worrying. And I think we have seen a coming together of all of the factors of the misinformation that we've talked about, the refusal to accept responsibility, the causes that I identified. And I'm not sure where that is going to leave us, because if Israel is curtailed in its entirely legitimate aim of getting rid of the threat that Hamas poses, then the world will be a very much more dangerous place, not just for Israelis, but for all Western liberal democratic.
Thanks, Natasha. Richard.
Yeah, I think the Prime Minister of Britain, he was here in Israel today, and he delivered what I thought was the most strongly supporting speech of Israel that any Prime Minister has ever delivered in the history of Israel, which I think is something he should be commended for. I think, having said that, I agree with Natasha that there are huge concerns about the maintenance of support from the United States and from the UK and other countries, because my view is that the world is not with Israel on this. They've said the right things sometimes, including Sunak's speech today. They made the right noises, but they're not really with Israel on this. And I think the longer we get, the further we get from the events of 2 weekends ago, and the memories fade, and memories fade very quickly. And the more the pressure builds up, the more the propaganda campaign against Israel builds up as Israel inflicts further and further casualties inside Gaza, which it will do. And when the ground operation starts, if it does, then I think our experience of that is that because infantry and tank and artillery operations are a far more blunt instrument than airstrikes, precision-guided missiles fired from the air. A much bigger proportion of civilians, I think, are likely to die, even though many have been pushed to the south, and the pressure will accumulate. And Hamas, of course, and the other terrorists in Gaza will inevitably maintain their propaganda campaign against Israel, which will be the media organizations that immediately condemned Israel for the hospital incident. They won't have learned anything from that. They're not going to suddenly think, well, we were wrong there, let's make sure we're not wrong again. It will continue, and the pressure will build up, and the pressure will continue, and political leaders will feel that pressure, and they will, I think, transfer it onto Israel. As the memories fade and as the casualties build up, we're going to see a dropping away, even of Sunak's strong support for Israel and Biden's support he's given so far for Israel as well. So I think that, as Natasha rightly said, that is a deeply worrying situation if it leads Israel to not achieve the objectives it set out for itself. And let's not, I mean, I've heard a lot of people over here saying, well, you know, Netanyahu should just go in and deal with it, whatever, tell Joe Biden to stop it. It's not that simple, of course, because there is an enormous international dependency here. And Israel it could do that. Potentially it could do that, but it will suffer probably hugely as a result. And that's not only in terms of the US continuing to provide Israel with military assistance. So it's a dangerous thing. And I think I only hope that our leaders are able to at least try and maintain the support they're giving now. But I'm not overly confident about that. I think the other dimension to be aware of is what happens up in the north, because we may well see a repetition in the north of what we're seeing in Gaza now, whether there's a ground offensive, which I think is possible, or simply an air campaign against Hezbollah. Don't forget, Hezbollah's missiles, like Hamas's, they're all in among the civilian population, and a lot of civilians are going to die. And because of the power of Hezbollah, the precision-guided missiles they have in some cases, and the sheer volume of missiles they have, estimated around 150,000, maybe more, maybe less, means that Israel is going to have to be absolutely brutal in the onslaught on southern Lebanon. And of course, that will add to the pressure from Western countries. Final point on this, I think the Arab countries, it sounds kind of counterintuitive, but I think the Arab countries will be, whatever they might say publicly, will remain far more supportive of Israel than many Western countries, because they fear the likes of Hamas. They want to see, I've had many messages from influential people in Arab countries and prominent people in Arab countries around the region who have told me that they want Israel to deal decisively with Hamas. Hamas is a problem, and the example Hamas provides is a problem for countries like Saudi Arabia, countries like Egypt, without a shadow of a doubt. So, I'm not really answering the question very well, but I think, there is a real danger that Israel will be pulled back from what it needs to do.
Okay, the next question I have is a short question. If it had been an Israeli missile that had hit the hospital in Gaza, which of course it wasn't, but if it had been an Israeli missile that had hit the hospital, what would have been the legal consequences for the IDF and Israel? Avi, would you like to go first?
Yeah, if I could. When I first saw the report of the strike in the hospital, and I saw the film, and the first thing that struck me about that film was that it was clear that there were two explosions. Something dropped and caused an explosion, and then a second or two later, there was a secondary explosion. And what that tells you is that the parking lot where that projectile struck, there were stored explosives or explosive materials, something that could produce that secondary explosion. So the first thing that you know about this episode is that Hamas committed the war crime of it's actually several war crimes of storing explosives at a hospital. That's a crime of human shielding. It's also a crime of abusing humanitarian symbols of protection. On the other hand, the projectile itself would only be a crime if targeted at civilians. Now, as it turns out, what struck the hospital was an errant missile of Palestine Islamic Jihad, which was aimed at Israeli civilians and fell short and instead struck the hospital. But if it had turned out that it had been an Israeli strike, either a strike at some legitimate target in the hospital parking lot, which obviously there was such a target if the secondary explosion went off, or if it had turned out that that Israel had misfired, that the maps of the pilots were wrong, they hit the wrong building. If you're intending to hit proper targets and you miss, or you hit a proper target and there is an amount of collateral damage that is not excessive, then those are legal strikes. So any way you look at it, Hamas clearly committed a crime. Finding out that it was a Palestine Islamic Jihad missile shows that they committed a crime. Whatever Israel had done, and as it turns out in this case, the only thing that Israel did was to be a target of a vicious a misinformation campaign of Hamas and its allies in the Western media. The only thing that Israel did is not in any way a crime. And any way you think about it, it's not. Wouldn't turn out that Israel had done anything wrong. So it's important for us to understand what happened in order to understand just how Hamas disinformation works, and more importantly, how many people knowingly echo Hamas propaganda, because the initial report was completely implausible. The initial report was that a strike in the hospital parking lot had killed at least 500 people, which is not possible. That it was an Israeli targeting of the hospital as such, which is theoretically possible, but in reality, anybody who knows the Israeli armed forces understands that's not possible either. And it's the sort of story that the moment you hear it, you should understand that something is wrong, but yet the Prime Minister of Canada echoed it. CNN echoed it. The New York Times echoed it. Right? Now, these are people who are willingly, knowingly going along with Hamas propaganda campaigns. They're citing figures from Hamas, attributing them to the so-called Gaza Health Ministry, which is run by Hamas, as if that's independent and credible information. What the whole episode told us is just how deep the rot is in among Western leaders and media in echoing knowingly false Hamas statements. But from the very beginning, from the very first moment, before it was even clear who struck, it was clear that there was the only crimes here were on the Palestinian side.
Thank you very much indeed, Avi. Next question, slightly different. Is Israel likely to ultimately be able to defeat Hamas, given that repeatedly polls by the Palestinian Center for Policy Research show that there is widespread support by Gazan Palestinians for armed struggle against Israel? It is arguable that Hamas, or a derivative of Hamas, could resurface again, leaving Israel vulnerable again. Where does Israel stand within international law to take steps to prevent another terrorist group taking root in Gaza? Natasha, would you like to go first?
But it goes to my earlier point, Gary, doesn't it, that this is not just about Hamas. And we saw Mahmoud Abbas coming out in the first instance to refuse to condemn these attacks, called it resistance. We've seen other Palestinian spokespeople, Hanan Nashrawi, doing every broadcast media imaginable, calling this justifiable resistance. So the idea that this disappears if Israel defeats Hamas is a fantasy. The Pay for Slay program that I mentioned makes no distinction between different brands of terrorists. So it's absolutely the case that even if Israel is successful in taking out the leadership and the structure that Hamas has been able to develop in its 16 years of turning Gaza into its fortified terror base, then the brainwashed individuals, subject, as I indicated, to that 30 years of brainwashing, will simply coalesce under a separate banner. And it's not the case that international law is so rigid as to only apply to groups that identify themselves in a particular brand or type and express themselves under a particular banner. We also, of course, saw several ISIS flags recovered from the communities that were attacked in southern Gaza, in southern Israel. So I think one aspect of this is that we need to step back and recognize that this is a much broader foe, as I indicated, that is shared by Israel and the West. And international humanitarian law allows Israel to take these measures in self-defense against any non-state actor in a non-international armed conflict, which many have characterized this as, that is threatening it and that is able to act on those threats. And so the same principles and the same rules that we've discussed in terms of the application of international humanitarian law would apply vis-a-vis Israel's activities against any other state. It's a little bit more complicated when you think about the PA in terms of the bilateral agreements that Israel has entered into. Everyone will be familiar with the Oslo Accords, but I have to stress that the status of that is perhaps unclear in circumstances where from the outset they have been breached in the worst possible way with the continuation of Palestinian terrorism.
Thank you, Natasha. Next question is slightly more military-minded. So I'm going to direct it at Richard.
I'm sorry, could I just...
Oh, sorry, Avi. Yes, certainly.
Yeah, just one thing that I need to add to what Natasha said, and what Natasha said is very important, but let's understand that there's there's two different kinds of problems that are being talked about here, right? There's a military problem. The military problem is Hamas and the allied terrorist organizations that control the Gaza Strip. And every combatant in any one of these terrorist organizations and every civilian who participates in the military activities, if it's as simple as transporting somebody knowingly to a different position, or transporting goods, or collecting information and delivering it, all those people are legitimate targets. However, the fact that it is a fact established by polling for decades that the vast majority of Palestinian civilians, the vast majority of Palestinians, support anti-Semitic terrorist organizations. There's no non-terrorist organization, political organization among the Palestinians that polls better than 3%. Okay, the vast majority support anti-Semitic terrorism, and in most of those cases, genocidal anti-Semitic terrorism. That said, the mere support does not make them military targets. The problem that Natasha is identifying, what do we do after Israel has completed combat against the military targets and destroyed them? What do we do about a population that is, if you'll excuse me, Nazified? Right? How do we denazify this population? That's an important question, but it's not a military question. Okay, it's one that we have to address, but it's not going to be addressed by the military.
Understood, Abby. Thank you very much. My next question is slightly military, so I'm going to direct it at Richard. How can Israel destroy the 30 miles of reinforced booby-trap tunnels which are deep underground in Gaza?
Well, there are numerous ways of doing it, and one example, obviously, explosives is one means of achieving that, and that can be done both from the ground and from the air, or both. And another way is, I think the Egyptians adopted a policy a few years back of flooding those tunnels to the extent that they eventually collapsed. So that can be done as well. It's it's not an easy thing when you consider the extent of the tunnels across the whole of Gaza, particularly in the north, but not just the north. But it can be done. It can be done by, as I say, predominantly by explosives and by water. Of course, one sort of side issue is that it may well be necessary for Israeli soldiers to enter those tunnels, because apart from anything else, the chances are that at least a significant number of Israeli hostages are being held in the tunnels, and so that's got to be taken into account. I just want to add one point to what Natasha and Avi said about the day after, so to speak. One thing that I don't think came out at Maidan was that it's not just in Gaza that Hamas enjoys enormous support. It's also in Judea and Samaria, or the West Bank, where if there was an election, recent polling shows, if there was an election today, it wouldn't be Fatah, it wouldn't be Abbas that won the election, it would be Hamas that won the election in the West Bank as well as in Gaza. It's by a significant margin. So there's that aspect. And the other point I think to think about, and I don't have any answers to this, is what actually does happen the day after, assuming Israel defeats and takes apart Hamas and all of its structures. What happens then? Hamas is the government of Gaza. A population emerging from a devastating war. Someone's got to run the place. Who's that going to be? Hamas is gone. It's not going to be the Palestinian Authority. They can't even exercise proper control over the areas that they're responsible for, and they wouldn't do this. It's not going to be Egypt. There's no possibility of Egypt doing it. Some have suggested it's not going to be the UN. It's not going to be the EU. Some have suggested that it could be a consortium of Arab countries, moderate Arab countries. Again, I think that's highly unlikely, which really leaves one possibility, in my opinion, and that's the IDF to run Gaza for the foreseeable future. Clearly fraught with immense difficulties, but I think I'm not saying that's going to happen. I think that's perhaps the most likely option, that we'll see the IDF in Gaza for a long, long time to come, even after Hamas has been destroyed. One thing we should not forget is Iraq. There wasn't enough time and effort and realistic planning given to dealing with Iraq after Saddam Hussein and his government was taken down. And we know what that resulted in. It resulted in a massive al-Qaeda campaign in Iraq, and it resulted in the creation of the Islamic State, which then rampaged around the region and around the world for many years afterwards. And therefore it's imperative, and I'm sure that the Israelis are examining it right now, it's imperative that sufficient thought and resources and action is given to what happens the day after.
Thank you very much, Richard. This next question is quite relevant to what's been happening in the UK in the last few days. Can law be used effectively against mass media spreading lies and incitement about the conflict? Natasha.
It's quite a significant problem because so much of what we would hope Ofcom would properly regulate on this has been so badly dealt with over the last couple of decades, even in terms of the misrepresentations about Israel specifically, and certainly the complaints process. The BBC is somewhat famous for this. That there are very few legal remedies available, if any. The difficulty is, of course, you cannot defame an individual and get away with it, and English law deals pretty well and robustly with defamation on that basis. But that doesn't apply to a people, it doesn't apply to a state, and it doesn't apply to an army. And in the context of freedom of speech, the legal ramifications for what we have witnessed, especially over the last few days, and the misreporting and the terrible incitement that we have seen as a result of that, is not something that can be easily grappled with. The best suggestion I can make is public pressure, and that has been building, especially on the BBC, because of their refusal to use the term terrorists, which has become utterly ridiculous. But Also now, very importantly, because of their consistent misrepresentations of international law, their false allegations of war crimes, and their misreporting vis-a-vis the strike on the convoy, which Israel has been clear it was not responsible for, the humanitarian convoy into the south of Gaza, and now most recently the hospital attack explosion. But unfortunately, under the current regulations and Ofcom, actual legal avenues for challenge are few and far between.
Thank you very much, Natasha. Avi, I have a question for you. How could Israel have miscalculated the Hamas threat so badly? And what steps should be taken in future to stop this ever happening again?
There's two different ways to examine this. There are operational failures and force structure failures and so on and so forth that are going to wait for the end of the war before there's any serious examination of them. But there's one failure, and it's a failure of imagination that is obvious already. And it's a failure up at the top, and I think it's the most serious one. Simply put, the majority of Israel's leaders, and in particular, the majority of Israel's security establishment, did not take seriously the declared aims of the Palestinian terrorist organizations. That is, the Palestinian terrorist organizations have stated for years, and this includes Fatah, this includes the PLO, this includes the leadership of the Palestinian Authority, have stated for years that there is no such thing as a legitimate Jewish state. Jews are not a legitimate people at all. There's various kinds of anti-Semitic rhetoric linked with genocidal intent and insinuations. They come, again, this from all the Palestinian terrorist organizations, including the one that's run by Mahmoud Abbas. Right? Mahmoud Abbas, just several months ago, gave a speech for which he was pilloried around Europe, although everybody's since ignored it, in which he engaged in Holocaust denial and spreading of anti-Semitic myths. This is simply the structure of these organizations, and these organizations are also quite clear. They've been clear for years that any discussions of ceasefires and peace and tranquility are tactical. In the case of Hamas, by the way, they were insincere and tactical. That is, Hamas was not interested in a ceasefire, but it was interested in putting out a message as if it were interested in a ceasefire in order to lull Israel into unpreparedness. And this, I think, is one of the central failures. Again, there are other failures that we're going to have to tackle after we get into a serious investigation of what went wrong after the war. And I have to say, by the way, just watching the fighting, I had an initial guess on certain things that had gone wrong as the news started coming out of the atrocities on October 7th. And then having spoken to a number of people who survived the events, that is, soldiers who came out and civilians, but primarily soldiers, it became clear that my initial impressions were wrong about what went wrong. That, okay, it's very difficult to know from initial reports, but that part of it, that Israel had underestimated the depth of hatred and fanaticism and the utter devotion at almost any cost to destroying the Jewish people and the Jewish state, that underestimated it at a terrible, terrible cost. And I can tell you that most of Israel is never going to make that mistake again.
Thank you, Avi. Richard and Natasha, do either of you have anything to add to what Avi's just said?
I think one thing I would say, and I agree entirely what Avi has to say there. I think this has been a very, very sophisticated deception plan by Hamas, which has worked. And this is not Hamas. This is not, as I said earlier on, this is not Hamas acting alone. This is Hamas acting under the hand of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, an arm of the Iranian state. And I just want to give you an example of the sophistication. Avi mentioned that it's been a kind of disingenuous attempt by Hamas to give the impression that they were willing to enter into a ceasefire in order to lull Israel into a full state of security. And I think I'll just give an example of what I think is the level of sophistication of this. And that is I think it was last year, there was I forget exactly now because I'm pretty senile, but I think it was last year, there was a major attack from Gaza by Islamic Jihad, a very, very significant rocket bombardment over several days of Israel by Islamic Jihad. Hamas did not take part in that. And a number of people I spoke to were saying, well, this is an indication that Hamas does not want war with Israel. They're focusing now on the economic development of the Gaza Strip. And I would guess, I don't have any evidence for this, I would guess that was deliberately planned to create exactly that impression, so that Hamas did not join in, so that Israel would be absolutely certain, right, we were right now, Hamas are not joining this attack, Hamas are not really a huge danger at the moment. And it was that that's a massively sophisticated deception plan, and I think that kind of feeds into the state of security that Israel managed to lull itself into thinking it had.
Thank you very much. My last question, and then we'll have a vote of thanks, is to what extent, and the answers here may differ around the world, there's a UK answer and there may be other answers. To what extent can demonstrations like from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, and other pro-Hamas type demonstrations be banned? Can I ask Avi first? The answers may be around the world at different answers.
Yeah, there are different answers in different places in the world, and there's two factors to this. So one of them obviously is a matter of freedom of speech. And as you can tell by the accents, the different members of the panel will probably have different approaches to what ought to be the limits of freedom of speech. So I think that Americans are known for having a quite extreme pro-speech approach, and I'm afraid that I'm guilty as charged on that. That said, there's another aspect to such things, and it has to do with a different set of rules. And these are rules having to do with support for terrorism. And there are cases, even in the United States, with its fanatically pro-speech approach, where the mere words can constitute material support for a terrorist organization. And if this seems odd, then don't think of the example of words in support of terrorism. Think of, let's say, conspiracy counts against members of an illegal, illicit crime organization, the mafia. Right? And so people can be convicted of mafia crimes simply on the basis of participating in the conspiracy by words alone. And so it depends on the phrasing of the statutes, but I think that when you see people engaging in words like that, it may be, depending on the phrasing of the statute, that may be support for terrorism that is criminal, even in the United States. Now, the other thing that's worth considering is that it's absolutely clear now that these organizations are genocidal, that people are on the basis of this carrying out genocidal acts, that is killing Jews as part of a worldwide network to destroy the Jewish people in whole or in part. And incitement to genocide is a crime, an international crime, and there are cases about this. And so, for example, in the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, convicted people of illegal incitement to genocide for simply saying on the air, "There is work to be done," because the audience understood there is work to be done to be a call to go kill Hutu or to go kill Tutsi, right? And that's enough. Now, is from the river to the sea, Palestine shall be free of itself a call for genocide? Well, it seems to me that that's even clearer than there is work to be done. Right. So I think that there's a very good argument to be made there. I'm going to have to excuse myself now because I have another broadcast to get to. So I thank you very, very much for having me.
Thank you very much, Avi. It's been great having you on. Thank you very much for your time and your wonderful contributions. So just release me to ask Natasha and then Richard if you have anything to add to that answer.
Well, of course, here, following on from that genocidal chant from the river to the sea, the Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, has recognised that this is exactly what it is. And on that level of analysis of the language, what the expressions are ultimately calling for, I mean, we've seen some prominent individuals tweeting victory to the Intifada in the context of the 7th of October massacres. And this is something that we've already seen government taking some action on. There was a revised guidance letter provided by the Home Secretary to police forces. What it really requires, though, is revised guidance for the Crown Prosecution Service to be able to take into account the development of calls for genocide that we have seen over the last couple of weeks. But of course, since Hamas is a prescribed terror organization here in the United Kingdom, support for Hamas voiced is an offence under Section 12(1)A of the 2000 Terrorism Act. And the difficulty is in enforcement and in ensuring that those who are voicing support for Hamas on the streets of the United Kingdom are prosecuted. That requires the consent of both the Director of Public Prosecutions and the Attorney General. But I am hopeful that with the development of the situation that we've witnessed and with increasing pressure from the legal fraternity who have recognised, I believe, the immense harm that this support for terrorism on our streets has been causing to the Jewish community here, that we will see some advance on that. If I could just finally very briefly pick up on that final question, because it won't surprise you to know that I agreed absolutely with everything that my fellow panelists said, but it strikes me that for the last 30 years, Israel and Israelis have been on a peace drug. Entirely understandable. And I think any human being could have sympathy for that. A desire to believe that Hamas and others could be bought with economic incentives and work permits for thousands of individuals to create that connection and build a better life for those living in Gaza as well as in Judea and Samaria and the West Bank. And those who warned that this was not possible, those who warned that something along the lines, although imagination perhaps didn't stretch that far, but that something along the lines of what happened 12, 13 days ago was likely, were ostracized, were outcast and accused of having a lack of imagination. And that is something that I agree that Israeli society as a whole has probably learned the lesson an incredibly hard way. But even now, we are seeing not just voices outside of Israel, but even some NGOs in Israel itself reverting to that same narrative. And that is of significant concern also.
Thank you, Natasha. Richard, you have the final word.
Thank you. I don't want to comment on the last question. I think that's been comprehensively answered by Avi and Natasha. But one thing I would say, I know that everyone listening to this, and I'm sure that everybody in the Jewish community in the UK is deeply, deeply concerned about Israel, what's happening and what's going to happen. And I know that many people over there in the Jewish community and in some other communities are working extremely hard to do whatever they can to support Israel. I mentioned that I've been around the borders of the Gaza Strip and Lebanon in the last few days. And I just want to share with you the fact that I am I was speaking to soldiers on the ground, including soldiers that are preparing to go in and put their lives on the line, and in many cases, unfortunately, will probably give their lives or suffer life-changing wounds. Talking to them, shaking their hands, looking them in the eye, was for me a deeply humbling and inspirational experience, because these young men, and they are young men that are going into Gaza, these young men and old men as well. There are quite a lot of quite elderly reservists who are preparing to attack. They are absolutely 100% committed, not to vengeance, not to retribution as the media would have you think, but they're committed to doing whatever they need to do, taking whatever risks they need to take to defend their families, their friends, and their country. And as I say, it was quite an awe-inspiring and an inspirational experience for me to see these people ready to do it. They know what they face, they know the dangers they face. And I did point out to many of them that the fight they're fighting a fight for Israel, but they're also fighting a fight for us. We're all threatened by this monstrous regime, which does not just exist in Gaza, Judea and Samaria, but exists around the world. And therefore, they're fighting at the front line of the fight for Western civilization today. And everything and anything that any of us can do to help that in whatever sphere we can, I think we have an absolute duty and obligation to do so and to give them all of our support.
Thank you very much. In a moment, I'm going to ask Keith Rowe, the Vice Chairman, to propose a vote of thanks. But first, I just want to remind everybody to go to our website, nja.org.uk. And if you're not already a member, please join. It's only £18 a year, or £10 a year if you give us a direct debit. Or if you want your shawl to join, it's only £150, and they can have 18 members for that money. We do a lot of different events, speaker meetings, social meetings, campaigns, lobbies, and so on. We're very, very active, having about 2 events a month. It's well worth joining. Okay, so www.nja.org.uk. Keith, over to you.
Thank you, Gary. And on behalf of the NJA, I would like to thank all 3 speakers for joining us this evening at such short notice. This event was organised by Dahlia and Steve within about 24 hours. And I'd like to, first of all, thank you for making yourselves available for us so freely this evening. Colonel Richard Kemp, thank you for your real-world experience of how the law applies on the battlefield. Whenever I hear that you're going to be on any of the media, I know that this is going to be an interview worth listening to with real-world practical experience behind it. So thank you for being with us this evening. And Avi Bell and Natasha Hausdorff, thank you for your detailed legal aspects, understandable by us non-lawyers, not only the legal aspects relating to Israel, but also the aspects relating to free speech, the aspects of law relating to how it actually applies to the terrorists themselves. So thank you. When somebody like myself is debating or even on the media sometimes and debating with people who've only learned their international law from the BBC, it's so much better to be properly informed, and I feel that I know the facts far more better and far more authoritatively from what I've heard this evening. So thank you for all of your contributions this evening. I do hope that as this situation develops in the weeks and months ahead, you will all just please keep in touch with us. Please keep giving us the benefit of your experience, and so that we can lean on you to know the true facts again. Thank you again for being with us tonight.
And thank you very much, Keith, for that vote of thanks. And it just remains for me to wish everybody an enjoyable rest of the evening. And I hope to see you at our next event. Thank you.